Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. And as you will see from my presentation, I don't actually work on curiosity. So for me, it's going to be a chance to learn a lot of things these days. So thank you. Okay. So one of the questions of this workshop is how sociality influences how we explore the world. So I'm going to take a step back and so when we here in this framework, the word explore refers to the active process of information seeking, whereas what I'm going to do today is to take a step back and consider how sociality influences how we see the world. And so what I'm going to show is that where we look at, what we look at spontaneously in the visual world is already selecting those aspects of the environment from which we can learn the most, that is a social interaction and social relationship in general. So one general idea is that living in a society, so social life, has made our brain smarter. So this is one of the most popular, advocates of the so-called social brain hypothesis, suggesting that the higher intellectual faculties of primates have evolved as an adaptation to the complexity of social living. For better or worse, styles of thinking which are primarily suited to social problem solving color the behavior of men and primates even toward the inanimate world. So the idea is that really like what has pushed the development of our higher level cognitive functions is our life, our living in a group, in a society. So one interesting aspect of this hypothesis is that it can account not only for the development of higher cognitive function, but also for the reorganization of the reshaping of more basic systems that probably pre-existed to social life. This is the case with the visual system, the human visual system. So a common view is that sociality has made our vision specialized, highly specialized, to a certain type of classes of stimuli that have a high social value and are biologically important, such as faces. So this is like the discovery of the visual specialization for faces has been one of the biggest discoveries in the past decades, anticipated by neuropsychological research showing selective deficit in face recognition in patients with local lesions in parts of the visual cortex, and then of course confirmed with the advent of neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging, and the discovery of specialized regions in the visual cortex for face recognition. So faces are special, but they are not unique. In the following years, then we have discovered a number of other specialized areas in the visual cortex for stimuli such as bodies or biological motions, all stimuli with very high social value. So what I'm going to add to this chunk of the literature is that sociality has not only made vision specialized, but also smarter, more sophisticated than we thought. So what do I mean by this? Now, in considering the relationship between social life and the visual system, one may have the impression that faces and bodies are just the tip of the iceberg, and we haven't yet seen what's underneath the water. So what is a social? So the core social content is relational. That is, the most important aspect of the social life are the relationships holding between social entities, to the point that I would say that faces and bodies are socially relevant objects only in that they carry the potential to realize social relationships. So what we really want to know, what understand of the social world is the relational structure. So we asked a very simple question. Is the visual system sensitive to socially relevant spatial relations as much as it is to socially relevant objects, such as faces and bodies? So to So this is the outline of the talk. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to show you some evidence suggesting that we see relations, social relations. So just like we see visual features, we see objects. Then I'm going to present other lines of research showing that this visual specialization for socially relevant spatial relations helps supports the system for understanding actions and social interactions. And finally, I will discuss how the ability to see, to perceive with our visual vision the relations might be sort of, one of the building blocks of the ability for social learning in infancy. So, seeing social relations, the case of facingness. So I define, so when we started this line of research, we considered perhaps most obvious case of a spatial relation, a socially relevant spatial relation, which I call facingness. So I define facingness as the mutual perceptual accessibility of two or more social agents. These spatial configurations of bodies is particularly important because favors a number of social behaviors such as gaze following, shared attention, and so perhaps because of this is common to many physical and communicative exchanges. Now, we made the hypothesis following this reasoning that these configuration encompassing multiple bodies might be a redundant feature of the social world, which may call for efficient coding in dedicated perceptual structures. So to illustrate better our hypothesis, now consider this very famous social scene. So the question is, how do we parse, how do we analyze these this kind of scenes? So as I said, the visual system likes bodies and faces, but this is not going to help much here because bodies and faces are everywhere. So here we made the hypothesis that in this kind of context, the spatial relations between bodies and faces matters the most. So here, for instance, we can anticipate that people would be looking more to the left side of the scene than to the right side of the scene by virtue of the relative positioning of these three bodies, these three guys, suggesting the unfolding of a discrete social interaction. So we presented this scene to people without any specific instruction in front of the eye tracker just to see how they would explore this scene. And this is exactly what we found. So of course, they look first at the center because it's the center of the screen. And in this case, it's also Jesus. But then they were more likely to attend to the right side of the screen than to the left side of the screen. So this was not even an experiment, but was sort of a proof of concept. So encouraged by this observation, we decided to turn it into a real experiment. And we considered the visual search paradigm. So in visual search, as you probably know, the subject has to look for a target, in this case, the cue, among a number of distractors. So, and we have used this paradigm to learn a lot about visual attention. Among the many things that we have learned, one is that the relationship between a target and distractors is not always asymmetric. So for instance, in this case, it's easier to find the Q among the O's than the O among the Q's. And when we see this kind of so-called visual search asymmetry, we can infer that in this case, the Q has something more, something that makes it more salient to visual attention than the O. So going back to our bodies, we wanted to see whether, in effect, this configuration of bodies is more salient, more important than this one. So we created this kind of stimuli that I call the facing dyads and non-facing dyads, identical except for the relative positioning of the bodies, facing or non-facing. So from these stimuli, we created this kind of visual search arrays. So in one condition, the subject had to look for the only facing dyad among a number of non-facing distractors. And in the other condition, they had to look for the only non-facing dyad among a number of facing distractors. So the task was very difficult because we flashed the stimuli very rapidly for a few milliseconds, and the subject had to report where the target was, right or left. And despite the difficulty of the task, we found a reliable advantage in detecting the facing dyad among the non-facing dyads than in the opposite condition. So now this was a very long line of research like that, in which we studied all the boundary conditions for this phenomenon. But the main result from this research was that beyond the locations, features, and objects, visual search, so visual attention, has rapid access to relations between objects, and in fact uses this information to give priority to facing seemingly interacting bodies. So in a crowded environment, this is where we look at more likely. Okay, so this idea that facing bodies are, so this encourage again this idea that facing bodies are special. So this special relation between social agent is something special for our visual system. And so when we think about special stimuli, again, we think about faces. These are really the gold standard of visual specialization, visual specificity. So faces are special because they are processed with a very specific visual mechanism that we call configural processing. This means that when we see a face, we access all the parts at once as a whole. And of course, this is a very efficient mechanism because we skip the part-by-part analysis. So we see a face as a whole, but at a cost. So if we break the canonical spatial relations between parts, we have a huge cost in face recognition. So this is a classic example, a classic marker of visual specificity that is called the face inversion effect. So here you see a classic pattern of performance in recognition of faces and also bodies relative to any other familiar object. So typically, as I said, we recognize, detect, identify faces much better than other familiar objects, but there is a larger sensitivity to the disruption of spatial relations that we measure in the form of inversion effect. So this is a very complicated and even controversial field of research, but for the sake of this talk, just keep in mind that the magnitude of this effect, the inversion effect, is a marker of how much the visual system is sensitive to a given stimulus. And not by chance, the inversion effect tends to be the highest for bodies and faces relative to any other visual object. Okay, now we wanted to know the inversion, how big is the inversion effect when instead of seeing one body, we see two bodies, and whether the spatial relations between two bodies matters. So we designed this paradigm in which we presented again the stimuli very rapidly for 30 milliseconds, and then we masked them. So stimuli were bodies, face-to-face, back-to-back, upright or inverted, because we wanted to measure the inversion effect, interleaved with pairs of chairs, face-to-face or back-to-back, upright or inverted, and plants. So this is how it looked like. You don't practically see anything. So subjects had just to report whether they've seen body, chairs, or plants, regardless of the positioning, the orientation, the number. It was just a basic level categorization task. So despite the difficulty of the task, we found that subjects were more likely to detect facing bodies as opposed to the very same bodies presented back to back. So the very same bodies were processed with a different sensitivity based on whether they were face-to-face or back-to-back. And moreover, we found a significantly larger inversion effect for facing bodies as opposed to non-facing bodies, for which the inversion effect almost disappeared. And I just want to mention, so by analogy with the interpretation of the face inversion effect, we took this as an indication of a particular visual sensitivity to facing bodies, seemingly interacting bodies. And I just want to mention that we have replicated this phenomenon in a number of studies, that the magnitude of the inversion effect that we observe for facing bodies is comparable to the inversion effect that is typically found for faces in green here. So it's actually the maximal magnitude of inversion effects ever reported in the literature. And in follow-up experiments, we demonstrated the specificity of this effect. So it doesn't work if we have a pairs of objects with a clear antero-posterior organization. It doesn't work, or it works less well if we had other bodies configurations or if we replace a body with an object. So it seems to be that there is a highly selective specificity for this kind of visual configuration. And I'm not going to go through this study, but it's just, converging evidence for the recruitment of configural processing of this highly specialized mechanism of visual specialization using a completely different paradigm and a completely different measure based on frequency tagging EEG. So if there are lovers of, the inversion effect controversy, I can go discuss more deeply this data. Okay, so is it really vision? Because, we set up the paradigms to make sure that we were, targeting the early stages, that there were no inferential processes going on, like subjects were not really staying, like processing whether there was an interaction or not, but it was really something about the visual system. So to address this, we looked into the brain, so into the visual areas using fMRI, and this is the research by Etienne Abbassi here on his first scanning day ever. In one of these experiments, we asked the subject to come to the lab, and they performed a visual categorization task that I've just explained. So they had, exactly the task that I explained, and we replicated the two-body inversion effect, which I remind you is like the larger inversion effect for facing relative to the same bodies presented back to back. So again, this is our index of visual specialization for this kind of stimuli. Okay, so then the subject came back to the lab for another session in which they took part in the fMRI experiment. So they were lying in the scanner while we showed just images of facing and non-facing bodies, upright or inverted, without any task. We just wanted to see how, we just wanted to measure the neural responses to this kind of images. Okay, so the first analysis that we did on the fMRI data was a simple contrast, facing versus non-facing bodies. And we already observed something interesting. There was a network of brain areas that responded more strongly to facing dyads as opposed to the very same bodies presented back to back. So and these regions were mostly in the visual cortex. So visually, from a visual viewpoint, these stimuli are identical. It's exactly the same visual information, except for the spatial relations. And this is triggering differential activity in the visual cortex. Okay, so, and this is not just any visual area. This is a part of the brain that is known as the extrastriate body area, which is a part of the brain specialized to body perception. And this is very close to the fusiform face area, which is a part of the brain specialized to faces. Okay, then we did another analysis in which we wanted to know in which part of the brain the activity was predicted by the behavioral pattern. So this index, this behavioral index of visual specificity. So for each voxel across the brain, we computed the neural two-body inversion effect, so the difference between the inversion effect for facing versus non-facing bodies. And then we ran a correlation for each individual between the two-body inversion effect that we measure with the behavior and the activity in each voxel. And what we find is that across the whole brain, this behavioral pattern for each individual predicted the activity just here in this part of the brain that again is in the visual cortex, overlaps with the region that responded more strongly to facing than to non-facing bodies, and again overlaps with the body-specific areas, these regions of that belong to the so-called person perception network. So to wrap up this bunch of observation, we observed that there was a stronger response to facing as opposed to non-facing dyads, so visually matched stimuli in visual areas, suggested that the very same bodies are represented in a dramatically different way depending on their spatial relation. And we found that this increase of activity was explained or correlated with our behavioral index of visual sensitivity to facing bodies, and that the network, the network of areas that perform this computation overlaps with the part of the brains that are selective to face and body perception. Okay, so this research suggests that, like I showed a number of behavioral and fMRI results showing that the visual system is capable of capturing spatial relations between bodies, and is particularly sensitive to spatial relations that are reliably associated with social interaction, such as the face-to-face body positioning. Now, what the system makes of this information? Why do we need a computation of relations so early in the network? So we addressed this hypothesis with another fMRI study in which we presented this kind of stimuli. So again, dynamic depictions of bodies interacting, not really interacting. There is never interaction in our stimuli. Like bodies were just positioned face to face, but without giving rise to any meaningful familiar interaction. So here they're just moving toward each other, the same bodies moving away from each other. And the reason why we use dynamic stimuli is because we were interested in this part of the brain, that is the posterior superior temporal sulcus, that is just anterior to the visual areas that showed to respond more to facing than to non-facing bodies. And this is a very interesting part of the brain because it's specialized to biological motion perception, and it's also considered in many models the main entry into the social brain network. So this region is more or less here in the superior temporal sulcus, and it's very close to the PSTS face area, that is a region that is selective to facial expressions, in general face motion. It's also very close to the TPJ, the temporoparietal junction, which is one key node in the mentalizing network, in the theory of mind network. And it's also close to this SI-ROI, which is a recently found region that responds selectively to the visual representation of social interactions. So this region is very important. It's close to all these socially relevant regions. Is specialized in biological motion perception, so it's important to recognize biological motion and from there action and movements. It has been studied a lot in the context of biological motion, but we didn't know whether it cares about, it can hold the representation of multiple biological movements, and whether it even cares about the spatial relations between multiple moving agents. So this is what we studied. Okay, so first, these are the results. What we found is that, so here you see the PSTS, and here you see the EBA. And what we found is that both in the left and in the right PSTS, we replicated the same effect that we observe in the EBA, in the visual areas for body perception. So also the PSTS responded more strongly to facing than to non-facing bodies, so to the very same bodies presented back to back. And when we use decoding, we also found that each body was represented significantly better when it was seen in a facing dyad than when it was seen in a non-facing dyad. So again, the visual representation of a body changes dramatically depending on whether we see it in a like seemingly interacting context, or we see it as independent, as is like acting in isolation. And here we run, in this study, we also run DCM, dynamic causal modeling, which is basically a method to study the effective connectivity between two systems to know how the activity in one system affects the activity in the other system. And here to study how the activity in the EBA so in the body perception area affects the activity in the PSTS, in the biological perception area, and vice versa. And so this is what we found. We found that the bidirectional connectivity between these two regions is increased when we presented face-to-face bodies, and it's even decreased when we see the very same bodies back to back. So what does it mean? This means that this stimulus, which is visually very similar to this other stimulus, carries a number of visual-spatial cues of interaction, such as the spatial proximity, the facingness, the approaching behavior, that are captured by the visual system and give rise to a dramatically different representation. So basically, the system is the visual system capture these relational cues of interaction, and this mechanism helps to channel body perception into action representation. So basically, when we see the increased connectivity between these two regions, it means that this stimulus is recognized by the visual system as an action, or better, an interaction, and then is pushed into the network for action representation. Whereas this system remains sort of, in the network for scene representation. There is really no interaction there going on. And so maybe this early network of visual areas can explain how the brain gives rise to the earliest rudimentary representation of a social interaction, just based on the mere physical structure of the input before any inferential process kicks in. Okay. In the last part of my talk, I want to just mention some developmental results showing that this mechanism for visual relation perception can support the earliest stages of social learning in infancy. So in this study, we presented, so we wanted to know whether infants as young as 6 months old were sensitive to the difference between these two stimuli that, again, is just a spatial relation, like identical bodies, identical body posture, just in different spatial relations. So we use eye tracking and a differential look-in time paradigm. And the idea here is that if infants looked at the two stimuli a different amount of time, it means that they have a different representation of these two stimuli. And this is exactly what we found. We found a significant difference in the time the infants looked at one stimulus versus the other. And we also ran a group with the stimuli inverted upside down, just to to exclude the role of any low-level difference that could trigger this differential look-in time effect. So as you may note, infants look differently at the two stimuli, but they look longer at non-facing dyads, which might be a little bit surprising if you think that, typically infants have a preference for social stimuli. But in our interpretation, actually, and what we saw with adults, is that the facing dyads are easier to process, are always easier, as I showed you before, are always easier to process than non-facing dyads. So our hypothesis here was that this effect was picking up the processing difference in processing one structure stimulus versus two independent bodies. And to test this hypothesis, in a new study, we compared the look-in times for each dyad, non-facing versus facing, compared with a single body. So the reasoning here is that if the difference between facing and non-facing bodies reflect sort of processing difficulties, we should find that there is a more similar looking time for this structure unitary configuration relative to the single bodies, and the larger difference between single bodies and back-to-back bodies. I hope that's clear. But this is exactly what we found. So basically, there was no difference in the look-in time that infants spend on single bodies and facing dyads. But again, when the single body was presented with back-to-back bodies, we found that infants looked significantly longer at back-to-back bodies. So we really took this, in this study, this look-in time as a measure of processing time, like reflecting the difficulty of the processing. Okay, so the last, I hope you have, like, if you, because this is a very, there is much more about this effect. I unfortunately can't tell you the whole story, but if you have questions even later, come ask me, because this is just the beginning of the story. Okay, the last thing that I want to mention, I'm a good 5 minutes. Okay, I'm good. So, the last thing that I wanted to mention is that, when we looked in, like, at the word, as I said at the beginning, all we want to know, all we want to understand is the causal structure of the word, the relational structure of the word. So in a social context, this corresponds to knowing, for instance, who is the agent and who is the patient, who is acting on and is doing what on whom. So again, there is some preliminary research that's showing that we are like, when we see this kind of complex visual scenes, we are very efficient at extracting information about who is the patient and who is the agent. So we designed an experiment to study whether the agent-patient distinction can be visually solved, again, based on the mere physical structure of the input in the absence of any knowledge about the event, the contextual information, and so on. So we created this kind of stimuli, very simple social scene. Here, the critical manipulation was that one body is in an agent-like posture, like is a little bit more dynamic, leaning toward, whereas the other agent is in a patient-like posture, a little bit more static, leaning backward. Okay, so because we wanted to see whether subjects automatically extract this information from visual scenes, we design a role switch paradigm. So here the subject had to look for a target, which could be, for instance, in this example, the male. And they just have to report in each trial whether the target was right or left of the screen. What we manipulated was whether from a trial to the other, the target stayed in an agent-like posture. The posture changed of the time, but it could either be in the category of agent-like, with the feature that I explained, or switched to a patient-like posture. So the idea is that if subjects are implicitly, automatically extracted this information when they see this kind of stimuli, they would be slower in the next trial when there is a role switch relative to the next trial when there is no role switch. So this is the hypothesis. And this is exactly what we found. Here you see two different replications of the effect. So positive values means that the participants looked longer when there was no, were faster, sorry, when there was no role switch relative to when there was role switch. So really suggesting that the subject automatically pick up that information. And so when, there is a switch, they are slower. We see it in this cost. Finally, we wanted to see whether also infants at 6 months are sensitive to this feature of the stimuli. So here we design a oddball task in which infants were habituated to certain configurations. So here in this example, girl is the agent, a boy is the patient, always as defined by the body posture. So girl is the agent, boy is the patient, girl is the agent, boy is the patient, girl is the agent. And all of a sudden, this configuration changed, and now the girl is the patient and the boy is the agent. So keep in mind that we always change the body posture, but so agent and patient-like were defined as a category. So we measured in this study pupil dilation as an index of surprise. And what we found is that, in fact, there was a larger dilation of the pupil when there was a switch in the role relative to when the role stayed the same. And because we were really surprising, I mean, think about it, these are 6-month-olds. They are faced with this kind of very rich stimuli. There are body postures, there are identities, there are lots of things. And they seems to be keeping track to process spontaneously these agent-patient-like distinction. So we wanted to replicate these results, and we turn it like we consider an habituation paradigm is the same logic, but just a different measure. So infants were habituated to a given configuration, and then in the test trial, there could be a switch in the configuration or not, and we replicated these results. So this is the final habituation trial, and you see that the look-in times increased when there was a switch of the agent patient, and they stay the same when there was no switch. Okay, conclusions. So I showed so there is this new category of visual stimuli, which we call facing dyads, that represent a new class of visual objects that are encoded with high efficiency and specialization in visual perception that we have learned to know, for instance, for face perception and body perception. This research is also pushing a little bit the boundaries of the visual system, discovering uncharted division that are devoted to relational and particularly social information, showing that beyond the location, features, and objects, vision can represent higher level relations that are the properties holding between objects. And finally, what I suggest is that these early perceptual adaptations to relational information may prepare the discovery of the killer backbone of cognition in infancy, which are relations. If I have one more minute, I would just, because I was invited here and I was like, I mean, there's really nothing about curiosity in my talk. So I was trying to ask, how this can be relevant for the enterprise that we are taking here. So one aspect of curiosity is the intrinsic motivation to observe others and their interaction. So I think what this research is suggesting is that some of this motivation is rooted in the functioning of our visual perception. Like our visual perception spontaneously drives us to see social relations, to identify, detect social relations, which are the which is the basis for social learning. Also, I also want to push this idea that what these results are showing us is that attention and perception do much of the work to encode those aspects of the environment from which we can learn the most, which are social relations and causal structures, such as the agent-patient structure. And unlike curiosity, these mechanisms do not imply an explicit mental representation of the need for new information. What I'm arguing here is that all this is automatic, is sort of, encoded automatically in the visual system. But like curiosity, they contribute to guide an individual toward important information and get it started down the road of knowledge acquisition. And I stop here, and thank you for the attention. Okay. So I monitor what's going on in the chat here, right? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this really great talk. I was wondering how much of your results are also related to statistical learning, because most scenes that we see involving people would have them in facing social interaction structure, right? And so maybe we're just more attuned to this kind of base rates, that people are more likely to be interacting and facing one another, and we're more attuned to this. And then the longer looking times that infants have for people who are not facing one another could be an indication of their surprise, because it's less common of a scene for them, right?
Thanks for the question. So when the infants look longer and non-facing dyads, it's surprise, and this is in line with what we suggest. Like there is this internal representation of how two bodies should be, And when this representation is broken, they look longer, they're surprised. So that's our interpretation. Just like if you present a scrambled face, infants might be looking more at a scrambled face because it doesn't match their internal representation. Related to statistical learning, I don't have a clear answer. It might be statistical learning. The only thing that we have done was, we did statistics on the web, like on Google image database, and we haven't found any evidence that in the natural scenes there is a higher frequency of facing bodies configuration. I developed a bias. So when I go around, I look like how many people are how many people are facing each other. And no one is like here. So it's a very interesting question. That was our way to sort of address that, but I don't have a better answer. I don't know. Yeah, okay. I decide, okay. It's getting violent.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I was wondering, when thinking about why has this sensitivity for the social interaction evolved, then one of the most obvious answers is because the social information is just so important for us to survive. And then I was a little bit surprised on, I think, the second study that you presented. You also presented all the stimuli that didn't work out. And there was this one scene where I thought, oh, that catches my attention, that looked like somebody is attacking the other person from behind. And then I thought, threatening interactions, even if the people are not facing each other, are also extremely important to detect for our survival. So I was wondering whether you've done anything going into that direction.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think we discussed that with Sophie yesterday dinner, because yeah, me too, I included that. Like at the beginning of this story, I was looking for a sort of visual subject, verb object structure. So I thought it could work for any configuration with an agent acting on something on someone else. So the case of these, what I call transitive relations, where one is attacking the other from behind. So like the effect is smaller than what we see for facing dyads, but it's definitely larger than all the other conditions. So this is what we discussed yesterday. In fact, in the paper, it's smaller, but it's still there. And that's the only study in which we have tested. So definitely there is more work to do with this kind of configurations. What I can add is that when we present transitive configurations in the agent-patient study, the last study in which subject attract the agent, it works with this kind of transitive condition. So when we put one body behind the other, the subjects are able to track agent and patient. So it means that they sort of recognize that as an interaction. Well, okay, Nivi, Sophie. No, yeah, I mean, I think there is time. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you so much. I have somewhat of a similar question about kind of positive or negative social interactions, and in the sense of the bodies facing away, there is something somewhat kind of anti-social about that. And you might already have kind of answers to this in the patient subject agent studies, but I'm wondering with the facing bodies, if you had kind of a more positive or negative facing interaction in terms of a more like positive social or antisocial status, if you think there would be kind of different kind of processing of those as well, or if you think the main thing is just like facing or not facing.
So I think it's just facingness. So we have, for instance, in the first paper we have analyzed the stimuli according to the meaningfulness, how meaningful familiar the interaction is, and there was no effect. Like, you know, some diets are more meaningful than others, and that doesn't seem to matter. And in another study that I didn't show today, we had a positive and negative interaction in the stimulus set, and that didn't matter. So really, like, I think it's really about this, all the subject. And, you know, it's interesting because when we asked the subject after the experiment, what did you see? They barely reported like facing, non-facing. They say all kinds of things. So it seems that they're not really even aware that, you know, this is the main feature of the stimuli. And so this is why we believe that it's really visual, and there is no much evaluation of really the content of the stimuli. There is something more I'll tell you later because I don't want to. Yeah. There is Hyo. No, Hyo has been like raising her hand. There was also Julian with a question. Okay.
Great. I was curious about the data you showed us. For the first study, you saw EBA activity, not along the STS. The later studies showed just as high activity along the left STS as well as the right STS, if not more in the left than right. So part of me was just wondering whether, like, is there something specifically social about the activities you observed in the brain? I think this ultimately ties to the questions that were raised on the other side of the room, but I was wondering how you think about these results and sort of the absence of the specific activity along the right side, which is typically more associated with social perception, and wondering whether this might actually reflect sort of more attention to those stimuli without necessarily recruiting like the social part of the brain network that we typically discuss. Curious about.
So thanks for your question. So the effects are left lateralized. Like we have now 4 fMRI studies and 1 TMS study, which has just been like finished when we TMS the 2 sides, and the effects are stronger when we TMS the left rather than the left. So the effects, and we were also surprised, like from the first study, we saw that the effect, they're always there, they are bilateral. Also, these are group, like a second level analysis, what I showed the maps, but we also look at the individual subject activity. So the effects are bilateral, but if anything, they are stronger on the left. You're right, typically we think that, you know, whatever is socially is right. And this is why I think that this is about action representation, like this idea that this visual, like socially relevant visual information is pushed into the network for action representation, which is notably left lateralized. So not maybe necessarily like pushing the activity in the mentalizing network in the social, but more like driving the activity of the action. But this is speculation. Like it's just like post hoc interpretation of this left lateralized effect.